The Dakota Territory stretched endless and raw beneath an October sky that threatened snow, its golden grasslands rolling like a frozen sea toward horizons that seemed to mock the very notion of boundaries. Thomas Whitehorse, though he bore his father's Scottish name, rode his buckskin mare through this vastness with the easy grace of a man who had learned the rhythms of the frontier in his blood and bones. But today, as he approached the settlement of Pine Ridge, his usual confidence was overshadowed by a weight he had carried in silence for 27 years. Thomas pulled his coat tighter against the wind and studied the scene spread before him in the valley below. Pine Ridge was preparing for something significant. He could see that much from the activity around the trading post and the unusual number of horses tied to hitching posts along the main street. Government officials in black suits stood in clusters, their urban clothes marking them as clearly as brands marked cattle. Army officers moved with military precision between buildings, while territorial politicians glad-handed anyone who looked important enough to matter. But it was the other group that held Thomas's attention, the delegation of Lakota Sioux gathered at the far end of the settlement, their presence both dignified and tense. Even from this distance, he could see the careful formality of their arrangement, the way they held themselves apart from the white officials who had summoned them here. This was clearly a treaty council, one of those official meetings where the government would present new terms for how the Sioux were expected to live on their own land. Thomas had seen such councils before, had witnessed the careful dance of translation and mistranslation that allowed both sides to leave, thinking they had achieved their goals while understanding completely different things. The thought of what was about to unfold in that valley made his stomach clench with familiar anxiety. He urged his mare down the slope toward the settlement, knowing that he couldn't avoid this moment any longer. For 27 years, he had hidden a secret that grew heavier with each passing season. Now circumstances were forcing him to choose between continued silence and a revelation that could change everything. For himself, for the Lakota delegation below, and for the fragile peace that hung over this corner of the territory like morning mist. Thomas had been born to a Scottish rancher and a Lakota woman named Morning Star, though few people knew the latter fact. His mother had died when he was barely 3 years old, and his grief-stricken father had raised him in the white world, determined to give his mixed-blood son every advantage that European heritage could provide. The boy had been told his mother was a white woman who had died in childbirth, a lie that James Whitehorse believed was merciful. But children have a way of discovering truth, despite their parents' best intentions. When Thomas was 8, he had overheard a conversation between his father and the local minister, a discussion about the Indian woman's boy and the challenges of raising a half-breed child in a world that had little patience for such complications. The revelation had hit the boy like a physical blow, explaining so many things he had never understood. The way some people looked at him, the careful distance his father maintained from certain topics, the dreams he sometimes had of singing in a language he didn't recognize. From that day forward, Thomas had begun a secret education in his mother's heritage. He listened to conversations between ranch hands and drifters, some of whom had lived among various tribes. He sought out books and newspaper accounts about Lakota customs and history, though most were written by white men who understood little of what they described. Most importantly, he began learning the Lakota language from an old trader named François Durand, a French-Canadian who had spent 30 years among the Sioux and spoke their tongue as fluently as his own. Language is the soul of a people, Durand had told him during one of their clandestine lessons. Learn to speak Lakota, and you will understand your mother's people from the inside, not just from the stories white men tell about them. Thomas had learned well, spending years mastering not just the vocabulary and grammar of Lakota, but the subtle nuances of meaning that distinguished a native speaker from someone who had merely memorized words. He learned the formal speech used in councils, the intimate language of family relationships, the sacred words employed in religious ceremonies. By the time he reached adulthood, he spoke Lakota as fluently as English. Though he had never revealed this ability to anyone, the knowledge had become both a treasure and a burden. It allowed him to understand things that other white men missed entirely. Conversations conducted in front of them by Lakota who assumed they wouldn't be understood. The deep cultural context behind seemingly simple statements. The vast gulf between what his people intended to say and what interpreters actually conveyed. But it also isolated him, creating a barrier between himself and both communities that grew stronger with each passing year. Now, as he rode into Pine Ridge and saw the familiar setup of a treaty council, Thomas knew that his moment of choice had finally arrived. The territorial governor had called this meeting to discuss new restrictions on Lakota hunting rights, claiming that recent conflicts required additional limitations on tribal movement. Thomas had read the government's position papers, and he knew they were based on deliberate misrepresentations of Lakota actions and intentions. He also knew that the official interpreter for this council would be Henry Morrison, a man whose grasp of Lakota was adequate for basic trade negotiations, but woefully insufficient for the complex legal and cultural concepts that would be discussed today. Morrison meant well, but his translations were often approximations at best, and sometimes entirely wrong. In a situation where every word could determine the future of thousands of people, such imprecision was potentially catastrophic. Thomas stabled his horse at the livery and walked toward the trading post where the council was being organized. The main room had been cleared of merchandise and arranged with chairs facing each other across an open space, government officials on one side, Lakota leaders on the other, with a small table in the middle for the interpreter and the treaty documents. As Thomas entered the room, he felt the familiar sensation of existing between worlds. To the white officials, he was simply another frontier settler, perhaps a rancher or trader drawn by curiosity about the proceedings. To the Lakota delegation, he was just another Wasiku, white man, whose presence carried no particular significance. Neither group could see the turmoil their assumptions created in his heart. He found a seat along the wall where he could observe without drawing attention and settled in to watch the drama unfold. The territorial governor, a portly man named Caldwell, who had never spent a night outdoors in his life, called the meeting to order with the kind of bureaucratic formality that was designed to impress rather than communicate. "Gentlemen," Caldwell announced, "we are here today to discuss new arrangements that will ensure peace and prosperity for all residents of this territory, both white and Indian. The United States government, in its wisdom and generosity, has prepared terms that will protect our Lakota friends while allowing for the continued development of our great nation." Henry Morrison began translating, and Thomas immediately winced. Morrison was rendering arrangements as commands, wisdom and generosity as simply power, and completely omitting the condescending phrase about our Lakota friends. The nuances of diplomatic language that Caldwell was using to soften his demands were being stripped away, leaving only the bare bones of governmental authority. On the Lakota side of the room, Thomas could see confusion and growing anger ripple through the delegation as Morrison's translation painted a much harsher picture than Caldwell's actual words. The chief representing the delegation, an elderly man named Spotted Eagle, spoke quietly to his counselors, and Thomas didn't need to hear the words to understand their concern. When Spotted Eagle rose to respond, his speech was measured and diplomatic, acknowledging the government's stated desire for peace while carefully outlining his people's perspective on the issues at hand. He spoke of the sacred relationship between the Lakota and the land, of promises made in previous treaties, of the need for his people to maintain their traditional ways of life while adapting to changing circumstances. Morrison's translation, however, turned Spotted Eagle's nuanced diplomacy into something that sounded almost like a threat. Complex spiritual concepts became superstitions. References to treaty obligations became demands, and expressions of willingness to negotiate became statements of inflexibility. Thomas watched Caldwell's face harden as Morrison's version painted the Lakota as unreasonable and potentially hostile. The pattern continued for over an hour, with each exchange driving the two sides further apart, despite their apparent attempts at reasonable dialogue. Thomas realized that he was watching a disaster unfold in slow motion, not because either side wanted conflict, but because they literally could not understand what the other was actually saying. The breaking point came when Caldwell began outlining the specific restrictions the government wanted to impose on Lakota hunting parties. The terms were harsh, but not necessarily unreasonable, framed in language that suggested they were temporary measures designed to prevent misunderstandings rather than permanent limitations on tribal sovereignty. But Morrison's translation presented them as permanent restrictions backed by military force, with no acknowledgement of Lakota rights or concerns. Worse, he mistranslated a key phrase about consultation with tribal leaders as orders to be obeyed without question. Thomas watched Spotted Eagle's face change as the translation reached him. The old chief's careful diplomacy gave way to controlled anger, and when he rose to respond, his words carried the formal cadences of someone delivering an ultimatum rather than continuing a negotiation. "If this is how the Great Father speaks to his children," Spotted Eagle said in Lakota, his voice carrying clearly across the sudden silence, "then his children must consider whether they wish to remain in such a family." Morrison, clearly struggling with the formal language and ceremonial phrases, translated this as, "The Indians reject your terms and threaten to leave the reservation." Thomas felt his heart sink as he watched Caldwell's reaction. The governor's face flushed red, and he half rose from his chair, clearly interpreting Spotted Eagle's statement as an act of defiance rather than an expression of hurt and confusion. "Gentlemen," Caldwell said, his diplomatic veneer cracking, "if you choose to reject the generous terms offered by the United States government, then you must face the consequences of that choice. This territory will not tolerate threats from any quarter." Morrison's translation was even worse, somehow managing to convey not just rejection, but active hostility. Thomas could see the Lakota delegation stiffening, their own diplomatic facades beginning to crumble in the face of what they perceived as governmental arrogance and bad faith. The moment had come. Thomas could sit silent and watch two groups of reasonable people stumble into conflict because they couldn't understand each other, or he could reveal the secret he had guarded for 2 decades and try to prevent a catastrophe. He stood slowly, feeling every eye in the room turn toward him. The sudden attention made him acutely aware of his mixed heritage, the high cheekbones and dark eyes that marked his Lakota blood, the pale skin and brown hair that allowed him to pass for white. For a moment, he felt frozen between identities, belonging fully to neither world. "Governor Caldwell," he said quietly, his voice cutting through the tense silence, "I believe there has been a misunderstanding." Caldwell turned toward him with obvious irritation. "I'm sorry, but this is an official proceeding. Observers are not permitted to—" "The translation is wrong," Thomas continued, ignoring the governor's protests. "What Chief Spotted Eagle actually said was quite different from what you heard." Morrison bristled at the implied criticism. "I've been interpreting for the territorial government for 5 years, young man. I think I know how to—" Thomas turned toward the Lakota delegation and spoke directly to Spotted Eagle in fluent, formal Lakota. "Honored grandfather, this young man humbly asks permission to speak. I believe the words between our peoples have become tangled, and perhaps I can help untangle them." The silence that followed was so complete that Thomas could hear the wind whistling through gaps in the building's log walls. Every person in the room, white and Lakota alike, stared at him with expressions ranging from shock to suspicion to something approaching awe. Spotted Eagle was the first to recover, his weathered face showing surprise but also a glimmer of hope. "You speak our language, young man, but who are you? What gives you the right to stand between two peoples?" Thomas took a deep breath, knowing that his next words would change his life forever. "I am Thomas Whitehorse, son of James Whitehorse and Morning Star of the Oglala Lakota. I have spent my life walking between two worlds, and perhaps that is why the spirits have placed me here today." The reaction was immediate and dramatic. On the white side of the room, there was a collective intake of breath as officials processed the revelation that the man they had assumed was one of them claimed Indian heritage. On the Lakota side, urgent whispered conversations broke out as the delegation tried to process this unexpected development. Spotted Eagle studied Thomas's face carefully, perhaps looking for family resemblances or other confirmation of his claimed heritage. "Morning Star," he said thoughtfully. "I knew a woman by that name. She married a white rancher and died young. If you are her son, then you are welcome among us." Governor Caldwell, meanwhile, was struggling to regain control of a situation that had suddenly become far more complex than he had anticipated. "Mr. Whitehorse, your background doesn't give you authority to interfere with official government business." "Perhaps not," Thomas agreed, "but my understanding of both languages gives me the ability to prevent a misunderstanding that could lead to unnecessary conflict." He turned back to Spotted Eagle and began speaking in Lakota, carefully explaining what the governor had actually said about the hunting restrictions. He translated not just the words, but the context, explaining the political pressures that had led to the proposed terms and the room for negotiation that existed within the governor's formal position. Then he turned to Caldwell and provided an equally careful translation of Spotted Eagle's original response, explaining the cultural and spiritual concepts that Morrison had failed to convey. He described the chief's willingness to work within the new restrictions while maintaining his people's dignity and essential freedoms. As Thomas spoke, he could see understanding beginning to replace suspicion on both sides of the room. The Lakota delegation realized that the government's terms, while difficult, were not the ultimatum they had believed them to be. The white officials understood that the Lakota response had been diplomatic rather than threatening. "Chief Spotted Eagle is willing to discuss reasonable restrictions on hunting parties," Thomas explained to Caldwell, "but he needs assurance that these measures are temporary and that his people will be consulted before any permanent changes are made." Caldwell nodded slowly. "That seems reasonable. We never intended these restrictions to be permanent." Thomas translated this for Spotted Eagle, who visibly relaxed for the first time since the meeting had begun. "Tell the governor that my people understand the need for caution during difficult times. We are willing to accept temporary restrictions if they help maintain peace." What followed was the most productive treaty negotiation Thomas had ever witnessed. With accurate translation flowing both ways, the two sides quickly found common ground on issues that had seemed irreconcilable just an hour earlier. Temporary hunting restrictions were agreed upon, with clear conditions for their removal. Consultation procedures were established to prevent future misunderstandings. Most importantly, both sides left the table feeling that they had been heard and respected. But the impact of Thomas's revelation extended far beyond the immediate negotiations. Word spread quickly through Pine Ridge that a mixed-blood man had emerged from apparent obscurity to prevent a potential conflict through his unique ability to bridge two cultures. The reaction from the white community was mixed. Some admired his courage and his contribution to peace, while others viewed his mixed heritage with suspicion or distaste. A few questioned his motives, wondering if his loyalty lay with his own people or with the government he had served as a translator. The Lakota response was more uniformly positive. Spotted Eagle and other elders were impressed by Thomas's fluency in their language and his deep understanding of their cultural concepts. They saw him as a valuable bridge between worlds, someone who could help his people navigate the increasingly complex relationship with white authority. "You have been walking between worlds," Spotted Eagle told him after the formal negotiations had concluded. "Perhaps it is time for you to choose which world you truly belong to." Thomas considered the question carefully. "With respect, grandfather, I think my purpose is to remain between worlds. Someone needs to stand in that space to translate not just words but understanding." Over the following months, Thomas found himself in increasing demand as a translator and mediator. Territorial officials began calling on him to help with complex negotiations, recognizing that his cultural fluency prevented the kinds of misunderstandings that had historically led to conflict. Lakota leaders sought his advice on dealing with government bureaucracy and his help in ensuring their concerns were accurately communicated to white authorities. The work was often difficult and emotionally draining. Thomas found himself constantly challenged by both sides, with whites questioning his loyalty to American interests, and some Lakota wondering if he had been corrupted by his upbringing in white society. He had to prove himself repeatedly, demonstrating through his actions that his goal was fairness and understanding rather than advancing any particular agenda. But there were also rewards. Thomas had the satisfaction of knowing that his work was making a real difference in people's lives. Treaties were negotiated more fairly, conflicts were resolved before they escalated into violence, and gradually a foundation of mutual respect began to develop between the two communities. The breakthrough came during what became known as the cattle crisis of the following spring. A severe winter had driven buffalo herds far south of their usual ranges, leaving many Lakota families facing starvation. At the same time, unusually harsh weather had killed large numbers of cattle belonging to white ranchers, creating economic hardship throughout the territory. Traditional approaches to such crises had typically involved government charity to the Lakota and emergency loans to white ranchers, programs that helped in the short term but created long-term dependencies and resentments. But Thomas proposed a different solution, a cooperative arrangement where Lakota hunting parties would help white ranchers recover and process the meat from cattle that had died in the winter, sharing the preserved food between both communities. The proposal faced immediate resistance from both sides. White ranchers were reluctant to work with Indians, while many Lakota saw the idea as demeaning make-work that forced them to depend on white charity. But Thomas's reputation as a fair mediator and his ability to explain the benefits in terms that both cultures could understand gradually won support for the plan. The cooperative arrangement proved beneficial to everyone involved. Lakota families received the food they needed to survive the crisis, while white ranchers salvaged value from cattle that would otherwise have been total losses. More importantly, working together gave members of both communities opportunities to see each other as individuals rather than stereotypes. Thomas found himself coordinating dozens of joint work crews, serving as both translator and mediator when cultural differences created friction. He learned to navigate the complex social dynamics that emerged when people who had been taught to distrust each other were forced to cooperate for mutual survival. The success of the cattle crisis cooperation led to other joint ventures. Lakota knowledge of local plants and weather patterns proved valuable to white farmers, while access to white markets and tools benefited Lakota families trying to supplement traditional livelihoods. Thomas became the crucial link that made these arrangements possible, translating not just language, but cultural expectations and business practices. But his most important work remained the prevention of conflicts through better communication. Time and again, Thomas found himself called upon to mediate disputes that arose from simple misunderstandings. A Lakota hunting party accused of theft when they were actually following traditional protocols. White settlers charged with trespassing when they were simply unfamiliar with tribal land concepts. Government officials whose policies were misinterpreted because of translation errors. Each successful mediation added to Thomas's reputation and credibility, but it also increased the pressure on him to be perfect. Both communities began to see him as indispensable, placing enormous weight on his shoulders as the primary bridge between their worlds. The stress of this responsibility began to take its toll. Thomas found himself constantly traveling between white settlements and Lakota camps, translating documents, mediating disputes, and serving as an unofficial ambassador for both sides. He had little time for his own life, no opportunity to form lasting relationships, and few people who understood the unique challenges of his position. The crisis came during the summer of his 30th year, when a series of misunderstandings threatened to unravel all the progress that had been made. A young Lakota warrior, acting without tribal authorization, had stolen horses from a white ranch. The rancher, not understanding tribal law and assuming the entire band was responsible, had filed charges against the tribal leadership. Government officials, eager to demonstrate their authority, had issued arrest warrants for several prominent chiefs. Thomas found himself caught in the middle of a situation that was spiraling toward violence. The Lakota were prepared to resist the arrests, seeing them as unjust punishment for an individual's actions. The territorial government was determined to demonstrate that they would not tolerate any challenge to their authority. Both sides were preparing for a confrontation that could destroy everything that had been built over the previous years. Working frantically, Thomas shuttled between the opposing camps, trying to find a solution that would satisfy both sides' need for justice while preventing bloodshed. He proposed that the young warrior be turned over to tribal justice, with compensation paid to the rancher for his stolen horses. But the government officials insisted on white justice, while some Lakota leaders argued that surrendering any of their people to white courts would set a dangerous precedent. For 3 days, Thomas negotiated with increasing desperation, watching positions harden on both sides despite his efforts to find middle ground. He began to realize that there might be no solution, that the fundamental differences between the two justice systems were irreconcilable, and that his role as mediator might have reached its limits. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. The young warrior who had caused the crisis approached Thomas directly, offering to surrender himself to white justice in order to prevent harm to his people. His act of courage provided the opening that Thomas needed to craft a compromise that satisfied both sides' essential demands. The resolution of the crisis enhanced Thomas's reputation even further, but it also highlighted the fragility of the peace he had helped to build. He realized that his work was not creating permanent solutions, but rather buying time. Time for both communities to adapt to changing circumstances, time for a new generation to grow up with different assumptions about each other, time for the larger forces of history to find their own equilibrium. As Thomas entered his 30s, he began to think more about legacy and the future. His work had proven that peaceful coexistence was possible, but it had also shown him that such cooperation required constant attention and care. He began training younger people from both communities to serve as translators and mediators, recognizing that the task was too large for any one person to handle indefinitely. One of his most promising students was a young Lakota woman named Sarah Standing Bear, who had been educated in both tribal traditions and white schools. She possessed the cultural fluency necessary to work between worlds, but she also brought a fresh perspective that wasn't burdened by Thomas's long history of walking between identities. "You have shown us that it is possible to honor both sides of our heritage," Sarah told him during one of their training sessions. "But perhaps the next generation can do more than just bridge differences. Perhaps we can create something new, something that combines the best of both worlds." Thomas looked at Sarah and the other young people he was training, seeing in them a hope that had sustained him through the most difficult moments of his career. They represented a future where mixed heritage would be seen as a strength rather than a burden, where the ability to navigate multiple cultures would be valued rather than questioned. When Thomas finally decided to step back from his role as primary mediator, he was 51 years old and had spent 2 decades working to build understanding between white and Lakota communities. The territory had been transformed during that time, not just through his efforts, but through the countless small acts of cooperation and understanding that his work had made possible. His farewell ceremony was held at Pine Ridge, in the same room where he had first revealed his ability to speak Lakota. Representatives from dozens of communities came to honor his contributions, including many of the officials who had been present at that first dramatic moment. Spotted Eagle, now ancient but still sharp, spoke for the Lakota community. "This man has been a bridge between our peoples when bridges seemed impossible to build. He has shown us that understanding is more powerful than force, that patience is stronger than anger. We will remember his example when future challenges test our resolve." Governor Caldwell, who had been replaced twice during Thomas's career but had returned to politics, spoke for the territorial government. Thomas Whitehorse has proven that the promise of America, that people of different backgrounds can work together for the common good, is not just an ideal, but a practical possibility. His work has made this territory safer and more prosperous for everyone. But perhaps the most meaningful tribute came from Sarah Standing Bear and the other young mediators Thomas had trained. They presented him with a special gift, a medallion that combined Lakota beadwork with European metalworking techniques, symbolizing the fusion of traditions that characterize the new generation's approach to their heritage. Thomas retired to a small ranch near the place where his parents had first met, spending his later years writing about his experiences and continuing to train young people in the arts of translation and mediation. He never married, but he was surrounded by an extended family of friends and former students who continued his work throughout the region. When he died at the age of 68, Thomas Whitehorse was mourned by both white and Lakota communities as a man who had proven that the divisions between peoples were not insurmountable. His funeral was conducted according to both Christian and Lakota traditions, reflecting the dual heritage he had finally learned to embrace rather than hide. The inscription on his gravestone, written in both English and Lakota, captured the essence of his life's work. He spoke for those who could not speak for themselves, and in doing so, he gave voice to the better angels of human nature. But Thomas's true legacy lived on in the institutions and relationships he had helped to create. The territory continued to be a model of peaceful coexistence, while the young mediators he had trained carried his methods to other regions where similar conflicts threatened to tear communities apart. And in Pine Ridge, the room where Thomas had first spoken, Lakota was preserved as a memorial to the power of language and understanding. Visitors could see the simple chairs where two peoples had sat in misunderstanding, and learn the story of how one man's courage to reveal his hidden heritage had changed the course of history. The memorial bore a plaque with Thomas's own words, taken from a speech he had given late in his career. "Language is not just words, it is the music of the human heart. When we truly learn to speak each other's language, we discover that we have been singing the same song all along."